In October 2025, total US public debt has surpassed $38 trillion. Every 100 days, America is adding $1 trillion to its national debt. That's almost $116,000 per second. The government now spends more on interest payments than it spends on national defense. At the same time, the US dollar index, which tracks the dollar's strength and people's confidence on the currency, has declined nearly 20% within just 3 years. This pattern's repeated throughout history. Fiat, or so-called paper currencies created without hard backing, began to lose trust and purchasing power. Most recently, it happened to Venezuelan Bolivar, and President Nicolas Maduro's solution was to print more currencies. But each time governments choose to print more, the currency collapsed, and this time the cycle is hitting the world's reserve currency.
The committee's plans lay out a deliberately cautious approach to avoid the kind of money market strains.
Our first year, we're going to be over $20 or $21 trillion of money coming into our country.
To understand where the dollar stands today, we need to look back to how it became the world's reserve currency in the first place, and what the future looks like if the fiat dollar is approaching its inevitable fate. So what exactly is fiat currency? The word fiat in Latin means "let it be done." Basically, it's money that exists because the government says it exists. It has value because the government declares it has value. Governments can print how much they want. There's nothing backing it. No gold, no silver, just trust. And for most of human history, this seemed insane. Money was gold. Money was silver. Things that you could hold. Things that were scarce. Things that couldn't be just printed out of thin air. Before World War II, if you wanted to understand global power, you looked at one currency, the British pound. Britain had the world's strongest currency. Their empire spanned the globe. The pound was used in nearly 50% of all the global trades. But the problem was, they were constantly involved in wars, and wars are expensive. So by the end of the World War II, Britain was kinda broke. USA, on the other hand, was doing something very clever. They were collecting lots of gold. European countries needed weapons, supplies, and resources. And America said, "Sure, we will sell you those things, but we want gold from you." So during the 1930s and 40s, gold was flowing out of Europe and into the United States. By the end of the World War II, America had accumulated the majority of the world's gold reserves. They had the gold, they had the military, and they had the economic power. And in 1944, delegations from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire to decide the future of global finance. And unsurprisingly, they made the US dollar the world's reserve currency. So here's how it worked. Every country would peg their currency to the dollar, and the dollar would be backed by gold. $35 could be exchanged for an ounce of gold, guaranteed by the US government. This was the deal. The dollar was as good as gold because it was gold just in paper form. Countries around the world could trade their dollars for actual gold from the US Treasury whenever they wanted. This was called the Bretton Woods system, and it made America the financial center of the world.
The United States dictated it pretty much to everybody. So-called Bretton Woods system that put the dollar on top. So by construction, we were the dominant currency. And how did that?
By the 1960s, America had a problem. They had been spending a lot of money. Wars in Korea and Vietnam, social programs at home, and other countries started getting suspicious. France literally sent warships to the New York harbor to collect their gold. And the US government realized, we don't have enough gold to cover all the dollars we have printed so far. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on TV and made an announcement that would change everything about the world's economy.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of...
He said temporarily, but that was 50 years ago. This was the rug pull. Nixon had just severed the last link between dollar and anything real. The dollar was now pure fiat currency. It was just a promise. But here's the thing about fiat currencies. They always fail. Not sometimes, not usually, always. In ancient times, the Roman Empire started debasing their currency, mixing cheap metals with silver. By the 3rd century, coins had less than 2% silver, trust on the government eroded, and the currency collapsed. Weimar Germany in the 1920s, they printed so much money that people used it as wallpaper because it was cheaper than buying actual wallpaper. Zimbabwe in 2000s, they printed a $100 trillion bill and it couldn't even buy you a bus ticket. Venezuela, Argentina, Hungary, Yugoslavia all happened in the last few decades. Every fiat system follows just one curve: print, inflate, and collapse. Since 1913, the US dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power, and since 1971, the time dollar became fiat currency, the decline accelerated. And every fiat currency in history has eventually gone to zero. And right now, the foundation of the fiat system, the trust on US dollar, is fading away, mainly because of two reasons. First, the 2008 housing bubble in the USA didn't just hurt America, it took the entire world into a recession. And that happened simply because the dollar sits at the core of the global finance. Secondly, in 2022, after the Russia-Ukraine war began, the US government freezed Russia's dollar reserves. This move showed that dollar holdings can be locked or restricted overnight. So nations started to rethink how safe their reserves really are. So now other countries started doing what America did to topple the British pound: accumulation of gold. I have talked about it in the last video how China, Russia, India, Turkey, especially BRICS and its associate countries are buying gold. You can check out this video as well if you haven't. This has a lot to do with this current trade war. All these things are interconnected. If you are curious, the earlier video covers that. So coming back to the topic. The countries are currently stockpiling gold to reduce dependence on the dollar. China and Russia are trading in yuan and ruble. India started buying oil in rupees. BRICS nations are discussing a gold-backed settlement currency. And they have pretty good reasons for this. The USA currently has over $38 trillion in national debt. And how do you deal with such huge debt? You can't really pay it back, so you devalue the currency. You print more dollars. You make each dollar worth less, so the debt becomes easier to manage. But there are two problems. Devaluing the reserve currency is not really sustainable in the long term. Every country holding dollars, every central bank with dollar reserves, their assets will depreciate. And another problem is that weaker dollar means other currencies will get stronger. So export-oriented countries like China and Germany will see their economic decline because their exports will be more expensive. That's why the countries are looking for an exit from this current system.
That's an issue. So I see the dollar fraying at the edges from China gradually breaking away. They don't want to be in our network on everything. They're willing. And the Europeans like it less than you think. I mean, they would like to be able to do more things in the euro.
But there is one more possibility. Back in July, President Donald Trump signed Genius Act to build the legal architecture for dollar-backed stablecoins. It will operate like cryptos, but essentially it will be a digital dollar replacing the fiat dollar. And if that happens, the idea is simple. The more widely stablecoins are used, the more financial value cycles back into the American system. And with that huge debt, even a small share of global digital transactions or reserves could help ease the pressure. And that brings us back to the square one. If the USA leans on a crypto-linked system to reduce the debt, then anyone, anywhere in the world using those digital coins will have to absorb America's debt pressure, whether they like it or not. So currencies may now face two paths. One is moving toward gold-backed stability, where trust comes from something tangible, something finite, and outside political control. This is the direction many countries are already moving toward, as they are increasing their gold reserves. On the other side is the crypto-linked system, government-regulated digital currencies and stablecoins that operate on blockchain rails. If the US succeeds, it can become a global settlement tool, tying much of the world's financial activity back to the American system. So it's worth watching which becomes dominant, because whichever system wins will define how money and power will work in coming decades.